leave things better than you found them. If you leave things better than you find them, the next generation is going to be stronger. The apples that grow in the next season are going to be better. The chili is going to be a little meatier. The tomatoes will be a little sweeter. I mean, everything gets better. Where we live, we have these acequias, so they're ditches, and they're centuries old. So hundreds of years ago, some folks had the wisdom to say, we're in the mountain desert. We can build these aqueducts into the land, and we can move water from where it melts in the mountains or where it accumulates and get it down into these communities to support healthier ecosystems and healthier families and food production. We still clean those by hand. Every year we get a shovel, we get our pala, you carve the sides, take a little bit off the bottom, you build the bank, you paint the brush, you do it by hand. Character building, tradition, culture, conservation, sustainability, defending ecosystems. In my front yard, I have this cottonwood tree that's over 200 years old. And it's strong, even though cottonwoods sometimes have a shorter lifespan, because it drinks where those roots have gotten deeper and deeper right off of that acequia. It's been hit by lightning twice that I know of. Once when I was home, the second time I had to go clean the stuff up. So it's strong. It's one of those trees where the family gathers. But it's a representation to me of my family. Deep roots with no matter what trials you get hit with, you stand there strong. You still provide a home to those birds and everyone looking for a safe place to be. You provide nourishment to everything around it that grows better because it has a little bit of shade without the intensity of the sun. And we learned all this not through social media. You know, Grandma and Grandpa said alone in Estola, they didn't have TikTok, X, Meta, all this stuff. It was oral history. It was passed from one family to another in the same way that I started. Trusted. You're going to see each other again. If you told me to do something to my chia and it died that next week, I'm going to go find you. We're going to have words. If you tell me to do something to that acequia and it deteriorates and the bait goes, everyone downstream of me and all those ecosystems are going to be destroyed. We have to trust one another. We have to ensure that when we're talking about the realities of hotter sun, of less water, of elements that get put into the ground that maybe came from a vehicle or were not properly disposed of or taken care of or broken down the right way, the devastation that it causes around us or being held, what it means to our bodies. It was trusted, family to family, neighbor to neighbor, sometimes along the fence line. So I shared, Mark asked, why did you get interested in this stuff around misinformation and doing something about it? Well, we all remember just a couple of years ago when COVID changed our lives. And there was a lot of information coming at us. What to do, what not to do. We even had a former president of the United States suggested that you should gargle with bleach. I hope no one did. You should be careful, he wants you to wash with that stuff. Misinformation was hurting us with our lives, with our bodies, our families, our loved ones. It was putting others in harm's way that maybe we didn't have a personal connection to, but they weren't that far away from us. Now that we can touch millions and millions of people with one click. It gives truth to the notion of how quickly a lie can travel around the world and how long it takes the truth to catch up. I think, Madeline, what you had shared with me earlier is it takes about as long for a lie to travel the globe as it takes for the truth to put its shoe on. Mm. Not when my grandma and grandpa were alive, not when they were raising us. There was something you could do that was significant about lies, and that's what they were, not mistruth. They were lies. People were intentionally trying to hurt you. They gave you the mistruth to disguise you. That's what's been plaguing us with all the misinformation surrounding climate, surrounding health, surrounding injustices that exist in communities where people were not seen, were not heard, were not elevated. So it turns out we can do something about this, right? I've been told that everything takes it back to Congress. Here I am. Well, I'm one voice and one person. I've learned the value of those friendships and those networks. My father, who was an elected leader, also reminded me, no matter what school you go to, how intelligent you are, how well read you are, your experiences in this world, the wealth you may accumulate, the art you may accumulate, whatever it may be, don't forget how to count. And I'm often surprised how many people that I work with forget the value of basic arithmetic. So don't ever forget it. But therein lies an act of Congress, basic arithmetic, having more votes than the other side. So Roberta, from Yankees, helped our team develop something called listos. Now, listos, you know what listos is, ready. Yeah. I have to explain what listos is to a lot of offices and colleagues that we work with about being ready. It's being ready to stop this notion of the spread of misinformation. It's horrible in English. Much worse in non-English, especially Spanish, not just across the United States, around the world. And so the effort here is to lean in to look at all these aspects of policies that exist internally with companies and say, hey, we can do better. Let's hold each other accountable. Let's establish guardrails so that this does not spread, so that we can stop it. Because my conversations with other members of the US Senate or of the House are the same that I have with leaders in other parts of the world that may be exploring guardrails, rules, structures surrounding social media tools. The exploitation that took place out in the Amazon, where another country came in and built some infrastructure and used horrible materials, didn't hire any local indigenous help, and once it started to deteriorate, they just left. They left this mess, destroyed ecosystems under the false promises that it would not hurt the ecosystem, that it would not hurt the challenges that are in front of us because of climate. They were lines that were being shared to these communities and indigenous communities where there was no connectivity. But mistruth can move in different ways. What we're talking about today is stopping it with the tools that avail themselves to us through technology. But let's also be mindful with everyone that you network with around the world. Every one of those conversations, every one of those elevator rides, they matter. Because you never know who you're in there with, and they don't know who they're in there with. But there's decision makers. And so this is just one tool. And I appreciate what Roberta has empowered us to do with her expertise and how we lean on one another to do something profound about changing the conversation about all the eyes that are perceived to be closed that allow this to happen. Open our eyes. Let's stand up for one another. Whether it's a friend or someone that is yet to be a friend. We can make a profound difference. And so I'm just trying to do what Grandpa Celedon and Grandma Minnesota taught. Leave things better than they found. If I can do that, I will have done my part, and we're going to help millions and millions, billions of people in every corner of the world, especially our brothers and sisters who are often forgotten and who are often not seen. So thanks for having me, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. So thank you all for being here. Today we're going to touch on an issue that the Senator mentioned that is near and dear to a lot of us, even if we don't know it. I can share with you that for me, this particular issue is close to home just because, you know, as soon as COVID hit, for example, my mom, you know, she's in her 60s, she's an undocumented woman that moved to the United States from Mexico. And, you know, as soon as she moved here, there's availability to technology and, with the prevalence of iPhones and tablets, she soon wanted to get money. And one of the first things that, I helped her to do was to connect and be able to have access to one of those devices. And even though she didn't know what an iCloud was, or she didn't know what Gmail was, as soon as I helped her set that up, he was able to then connect to WhatsApp and all of these different technologies that we can now access. And soon after that is when I started seeing that we saw all of these interesting memes, let's say, that we would get shared right on WhatsApp and all of these different social medias. And so today we're going to touch on climate denialism and climate disinformation and misinformation, and the availability that there is now with all of these devices that are now handheld, that are now in our pockets, and all the information that comes with it. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to thank you all for being here. And I really want to, thank the senator, and, let's keep pushing to make sure that these spaces where our family is getting their information is actually vetted and is actually being moderated, and there are controls enforced to make sure that we can continue to have the right information for people, because their lives depend on it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, founding president and CEO of GreenLatinos, and he will help us get started on this conversation. Thank you.
Well, let me pull up my notes. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I was up there with the senator. We have an incredible panel of speakers for you today, and I'm honored to introduce Santiago Lacatos from Graphika, Robert Braga, Director of Counter Disinformation Strategies from ECIS, and Antonieta Cadiz, the Deputy Executive Director of Climate Power and Acción. Let's hear it for them. Come on up. As a quick reminder, as you hear our fabulous speakers today, please make note of any questions that you may have for our panelists. We'll be leaving time for Q&A at the end. So I have an opening question, and you heard the senator speak, and he really spoke from the heart, and I would appreciate that. You sense that his rationale for why he is fighting climate disinformation and why he is making this a top issue for him with his Listos Act is authentic, and it comes from a place of the heart, a place of passion, and a place where he senses I can make a change, and so we got to do that together. So opening question for Santiago is, please tell us about your new report and describe the impact of those anti-renewable narratives on the renewable conversations, especially in Spanish.
Thank you for the question. Hello, everyone. My name is Santiago Lacatos. I'm an analyst at Graphika, social media analytics firm. So I'm here to present our most recent report, Renovables, which studies the anti-renewable conversation in Spanish. It's available both in English and Spanish at graphika.com. And to kind of start off to give some context, this is a follow-up to our previous report in 2022, Los Ecoilógicos, which broadly discussed the climate misinformation landscape in Spanish. So we created, in the process of creating this report, we built a map of the Spanish language conversation around renewable energy. So we did this by looking at key terms around anti-renewable narratives, And this was a map of communities on X, formerly known as Twitter, but the scope of our report broadly spread out. The report is a little long, but very interesting. I would encourage you all to read it in its entirety, but I'll kind of leave you with three key takeaways following up with your question. The first is the impact of some of these specific narratives on these unique narratives on Spanish language communities. So when we sampled these posts overall, what we found was that although anti-renewable narratives only made up half of the posts focusing on renewable energy within these communities, they made up over 2/3 of the engagement, showing how they're driving the conversation around renewable energy in some specific Spanish language communities. Sort of very engaging, forceful content that draws a lot of eyes and clicks. This specifically, one of the most insightful things we found was there was a narrative, actually the most engaged narrative, that claimed that wildfires were being set in order to clear land for the creation of renewable energy projects. So this consisted of claims that, decontextualized graphics and claims that, maybe a specific area where there was a wildfire, there's actually a renewable energy project planned there. Oh, what a coincidence. It goes from everything from what a coincidence to this is planned. And the most interesting thing about this, which contrasts with our other research, is that this narrative actually originated in Spanish. So it was first popularized in Spanish, which is something we haven't seen before. Previously, in our research, we found that there's a lot of translation from English to Spanish, these sort of like catchy claims and pieces of misinformation. But this is a really unique case. And it's especially interesting because it started in Greek, actually, a very small scale, like some social media posts in Portuguese, before in summer 2022, make a massive spike in mentions of this around wildfires in Spain. We saw a similar, even larger spike in April 2023 in Spain during the Asturias wildfires, showing sort of a reoccurring trend ever since then. For example, the Maui wildfires, we saw another jump in Spanish, but now we're also seeing correlating jumps in English as well. So this is becoming sort of a reoccurring claim. I think some of you may be familiar with some of the claims around Maui that were covered a bit in the English press, but it really started off in Spanish. The second, and what I would add is that this is likely to continue to reoccur, given how catchy and how engaging this can be for audience. So it's already shown its ability to spread, and as we've seen in English, there might be repeated narratives around whenever there's a large wildfire receiving a lot of media attention. The same thing will probably be happening in Spanish. The second key takeaway related to this last one is the correlation between extreme weather events and anti-renewable misinformation. So what we saw in this instance, and what we're likely to see going forward, is every time there's one of these extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change, so large wildfire megafires, for example, there's going to be likely going to be a corresponding spike in anti-renewable misinformation somehow tied into it. And as these events become more and more frequent, as we all are aware, is exacerbated by the effects of extreme heat, climate change, etc., it's likely to continue to happen. And it's something that I think, as all of us stakeholders, need to really just understand what the conversation might be happening, both in English and in Spanish. And the third and final key takeaway actually has to do with translation, because while there was this instance of a very interesting and highly engaged narrative about renewables, specifically starting in Spanish, there was still a lot of translation from English language anti-renewable misinformation into Spanish. Two of the other biggest narratives, we found direct correlations from jumps that they made in English to jumps into Spanish, similar graphics, similar content, talking points, keywords. And this is something we've already documented in the past, is going to likely continue to occur. And related, I think, especially when we talk about climate solutions and what plays into that, a trend that we started to see in Spain, that we've seen in the US, is the growth of local Facebook groups that are sort of nominally created about a specific energy project, and whether it might be wind farm or maybe a solar farm, that then sort of convert from what is, where people have valid reasons to be concerned about whatever something might be built, into big sort of transform into repositories of anti-renewable misinformation and climate misinformation, being sort of a funnel into that sort of content. And I think this is the first instance we actually documented that in Spanish. We've seen a lot of it in English. But yeah, that's just a couple of takeaways, but happy to break down the report more. I encourage you all to read it.
And you talked about the translation from English to Spanish. Is it most of the time the origins of this narrative are in English and then they get translated to other languages, or sometimes the narrative starts in Spanish or originates? Or and then what happened? Is this also occurring in Mandarin and other languages?
Well, I can say for other languages that wasn't in the scope of the report, but anecdotally, we've seen the same thing. So the wildfire narrative, as I mentioned, that jumped and really popularized in Spanish, and then it also popularized in German, and then it also popularized in French, and it sort of became along with English. So it became this sort of once it picks up one place, climate misinformation communities are interconnected across languages. It's not the same way when you don't share language, but it's sort of these memes or these sort of claims they find a way to make the jump through translation.
Yeah, and is there one dominant country of origin of these narratives?
Yes. So in the map that we made of these communities, around over a third of the members are in Spain. So there's a very strong like Spanish language anti-renewable community within the broader sort of Spanish right-wing community. One thing I should have emphasized before is that a lot of these almost all these anti-renewable actors focus on anti-renewable narratives as a subset of what they're sharing. So it's not, this is what they're doing all the time. It's more, they're sharing a broader right-wing position, and in some cases that anti-renewable narratives lead into that, or that's a part of it. It's sort of a talking point. So it especially when it occurs when there's instances such as like with a wildfire.
Thank you. Roberta, oh yeah.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antonieta. I'm from Climate Power. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I just wanted to add a little bit on the report. I really enjoy, having this report. As a former reporter myself, I think there is still this misconception in the disinformation universe, where climate disinformation per se is not a natural thing to identify. So, for example, for reporters, for editors in Spanish media, disinformation is just a general problem, but they are not capable to identify the disinformation messages that are related specifically to climate. And I think having this report and having these numbers is really useful to help that conversation move forward, because we have something to show reporters and say, hey, this is climate disinformation. These are the type of messages that we are seeing in Spanish. So we need to be more alert and do something about this.
And Roberta, I saw that you worked a lot with Senator Lujan on his work, and that's great. In your work with that, and in your reading of in the report that came out, what you see trends, and you see trends that match your trends in your research with ECIs?
Yes. Short answer is yes. So at ECIs, we are bringing together public opinion research and the narrative analysis and investigations on social media to try to understand the extent to which disinformation circulates in Latino spaces online, in English and Spanish, and to also determine and try to quantify, or at least understand, the extent to which disinformation is impacting Latinos' beliefs and also their behavior. We've looked at disinformation narratives both in the US context within communities of Latinos in different states, but also we've tracked the cycle of the borderless narratives that circulate between the US and Latin America. And so the first trend that I wanted to point out was that Latinos in the United States are engaging with and being influenced by content both from the United States and Latin America. Content from Latin America shapes their views and vice versa. In the report, you mentioned that there were a lot of a lot of the clusters of content originated in Spain or Latin America and then cycled. And so that is definitely something that we see, not just in climate related or renewables related narratives, but by and large in different issues. The second thing I would say is, rather than thinking of this as like a domino effect, I like to think of it as cycles, because a lot of what we see is recycled what I'm going to call master narratives. So for example, election fraud narratives, they didn't start in one place and then disseminate in a linear fashion to other countries. We've actually been seeing a lot of these in different countries for years and years. And what happens is that different pieces of content or different, manipulated photos or videos then get used to sort of underpin or justify what those master narratives are in different moments in time where they're most salient. There were a couple of instances that you pointed out of this happening in the report as well. The other thing that I would mention, you talked a little bit about this, is the English language origins of content that then get co-opted and translated into Spanish. In the US, we do see that a lot. So a lot of the similar far right-wing movements or extremist movements or QAnon or conspiracy network movements, they're actually communicating with each other and amplifying each other's content across borders. So they do engage with each other's content, and when similar things happen, they use that to justify their pre-existing beliefs. You also mentioned in the report that the groups that were most amplifying these narratives tended to be affiliated, I know, with political party Vox. They tend to be more hyper-conservative, sometimes adopting conspiracy theories. That's the other thing I wanted to bring up. So our research last year, we did a poll of 2,400 Latinos where we tested 16 false narratives, and we wanted to see, were people familiar with these and were they believing it? And each person saw 8 of these narratives. What we found was, one, a lot of people were familiar, but they were not believing. So I would say the majority of Latinos are not seeing and believing this information online. I think that's really a positive thing for us in this room, because we see these clusters amplifying, and I think that'll be problematic, but it's important to remember that they are not widespread at scale yet. And the second thing I wanted to point out is that our research found that it's not low education, low information people that are seeing and believing disinformation narratives like these. It tends to be more politically engaged, partisan, affluent, college-educated Latinos that both see more and believe more disinformation. And so I think and it's not demographic breakdowns that tends to predict whether they believe more disinformation. It's actually those things that the report mentioned. So specific characteristics or predispositions of a person's personality, like whether they believe other conspiracy theories. I think in this case, the last thing I would say is we've actually seen a lot of these global control narratives that claim that the international institutions are the global leader trying to manufacture these crises to manipulate us. It's specifically relevant around the Sustainable Development Goals, which I know Santiago, there was a piece of that in the report as well. But I wanted to mention these things don't happen in silos. They're all mutually reinforcing. And so I think for us, it's important to remember, one, that it's not that people are gullible and that's why they're believing this. I think it changes how we engage with them and intervene. I think we actually have to play to their identities. We have to play to community thinking. There's a job to be done on inoculating people around climate information, helping people understand the nuance before they come across the information. And lastly, really focusing on exposing to people specific tactics that bad actors might use to try to influence them or convince them of something. So for example, using emotional language like fear mongering or false dichotomies, you're either with us or you're with them, things like that. So.
It was surprising to me the demographic that you talked about of who is being influenced. Is that demographic parallel to Spanish language as it is to English language, who is influenced by this kind of disinformation?
So my comment here is that these were the results of only one poll. So as accused, our leadership would say we need to replicate this to really determine. This poll was conducted in both English and Spanish. And so we had English dominant, Spanish dominant, and bilingual Latinos taking the poll. And yes, so by and large, the trend was that it's not the fact that you have a lack of access to information that determines whether you believe something. It's actually what type of media you consume. It's not whether you're college educated or not college educated. It's actually how politically engaged you are and how big of a part of your identity that is. So I think sometimes it's not that people are being tricked. It's that they're adopting something that reaffirms their pre-existing beliefs.
Antonieta, at Climate Power, you oftentimes study the effects of comms on the Latino community on the ground. How is it moving them? What's it getting them to do? When we see the potentially negative effects of climate misinformation, do you see any negative effects about their impression on IRA, about the Inflation Reduction Act, or the infrastructure bill, or the opportunities that are out there that the federal government is presenting for grant opportunities to go after climate crisis? Does it make people disbelieve in those opportunities? Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah, I am seeing it all over the place, unfortunately. And I'm going to talk about a personal, information here. When I went to my hairstylist, for example, like a month ago, we always talk. So she was talking to me about clean energy and about solar panels. And she started to tell me about how this is to control us. And it's a government control. And she started replicating all these disinformation messages. And I was like, I cannot believe this. I work on communications and my hairstylist is having this problem. So I think it's at all levels, and I think it's important to realize that, for example, having the Inflation Reduction Act, it was an accomplishment for many of you that have fought for so many years to advance climate progress. The implementation of this legislation is crucial. Its popularity, it's crucial. And disinformation is an enemy to this success. It's a problem. Because if the legislation is not successful, first, people will not take advantage of the opportunities that they have with these new resources. This will impact all organizations that work in this area, also the people that can access to the tax credits, for example, that can do something for their homes, for their businesses. And of course, if we think about the future, if we want more climate progress, we need to show that this was successful. And this has to do a lot with communications and with perceptions and with persuasion. And disinformation is key to all these things. So I would say that I am deeply engaged with more climate progress in the future, but disinformation is a huge problem right now because it's something that can stop climate progress in the future if we let it grow unsupervised and without any limitations.
And do you see that, like, if I was to read some of this disinformation, if I was more engaged in social media, and that does it lead people who already are tending towards not wanting to believe the benefits of what Biden and this administration is doing? Or is it actually switching people into that of not believing?
I think it has an impact in both sides. I think that it helps to make decisions actually if you actually believe in this information. And the population that is believing in these messages, it's surprisingly population that is educated, that you would think that they are prepared to actually identify these messages and actually reject them and not multiply the disinformation. That is not happening today. And one other thing that, like, for example, in Climate Power, what we did last year, we did a study on the most prevalent disinformation messages that were impacting Latinos in Spanish. And then what we did with that, we did a campaign to counter disinformation messages. And we tried to measure the impact of that campaign. And what we learned there is that actually when you present the facts to people, you counter the specific disinformation message, that has an impact, but it dies over time. So that is the problem. It needs to be a constant work that goes in progression. You cannot just counter disinformation and then stop. That's why the work of everyone here is so important, because we need to partner to do more in this area.
This is my question, last question was for everyone, so if you have questions, that's great to get ready. So one of the things you mentioned is that one of the biggest hooks for high levels of climate misinformation is when you have climate-related disasters. You have climate-related disasters, the news cycle just ramps up on the hurricane, the drought, the flood, whatever, the wildfire. And it gets everyone's attention, in Maui or wherever it's gonna be. And those are gonna happen more and more frequently. And so these hooks, these opportunities for climate misinformation are gonna come at a more rapid pace, and people are gonna see that more often. So what can we do to combat it? What can we do to push back and break the cycle of having these high profile events taking place and then having misconceptions and misinformation spread? Fight it out.
I'll start.
Okay.
I would say, and I come at this from the research side, so I will let the comms people take that part. But the important part is being prepared, and recognizing, I think we're doing the first part here today, and through the process of this report, but it's just understanding that this is a cycle that we need to be able to, break and recognize when it's happening. So it could be, a major national event that's getting like national media attention, everything from that to like, I grew up in Southern California, there's a lot of wildfires, not all of them got on the national news, but they're always on the local news. And it's a big deal because people's homes are threatened, they have to evacuate, it's a whole thing. So it's recognizing when these events are happening to keep, when you come at it from the breaking the cycle side is to keep your eye out. It's just really sounds really simple and basic, but if you're going to be able, you need to be able to recognize when this is going to happen. And it might just have to be that it's a lot more because the situation that we're going to be in going forward. But yeah, I think that's probably
I would say use trusted messengers. What we learned from, the study that we did last year on our campaign is that we really trust experts. We trust the media still. We trust like voices that can bring us information from the community itself. So like amplify as much as you can these voices with facts to counter the disinformation out there. I think that's the most effective tool we have.
Real quick, who are our trusted messengers? What type? Is it electeds? Is it health leaders?
It's experts, it's scientists, it depends on the topic, but for example, it can be a business leader that talks about clean energy. It can be anyone inserted in the community that cannot lift a specific narrative that counters the disinformation narrative. It can perfectly be you.
Oh, I can't. It's a trusted. All right.
One thing on the trusted messenger piece, local journalists are actually still very trusted. To your point, we did a test last year where we tested 3 messenger profiles: a journalist, an advocate, and your friend next door, with one message about Kamala Harris not having sworn in on the Bible. And we found actually that even though all 3 messenger personas were effective at moving people either from being not sure whether that message was true or false to being sure it was false, or all the way from believing that it was true to being sure that it was false. But the journalist was the most effective messenger, even though people self-reported thinking that person was the least likable and least trustworthy of the 3. And so there's still something about the institution of journalism that is respected, as I think local journalists to your point earlier. And then to complete your question, I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll say 4 things. One is, when it comes to information disorder online, there's no one thing. It's not this or that, or like only do this and never do that. Actually, everything works in different instances and to different extents. And so I think it's more investment in good communication. So just proactive explaining and making sure that that information is getting to people actually where they consume information, which for Latinos, it's frequently on YouTube or WhatsApp. The second is investing in pre-bunking and debunking. So both getting ahead of the narrative by putting out things out there, exposing tactics, or in our case, because we know these things tend to recycle every time something big happens, kind of preempting what people might see so that they're more prepared when they see it, and debunking, which is more fact checking. So investing in fact checkers that can really rapidly react when these disasters happen. And the last thing I would say is being a friend of mine, Katie Harbath recently coined this term, but I think it's really appropriate. Panic responsibly. I think when it comes to disinformation, especially when big events happen, I think we see a couple of really like shocking pieces of false or misleading content online, and we assume that's everywhere, and we assume everyone's seeing it, and then we go and we react to it, and it amplifies and mainstreams that somewhat extreme piece of content. And so I think as a society in general, we need to remember that one, we should be aware of how these narratives are breaking out. So are they spreading only in one platform, multiple platforms? Are they being amplified by journalists or not? Are they affecting more than one community or just a small part of a community? All of that is important when we decide whether or not we should cover or react to something. And the other part is just, we need to be careful how we talk about people and their susceptibility to disinformation. The more you say that someone is, the more you insinuate that people are gullible or that they're falling for things, the more they feel like they are, the more they get painted that way. And so I think we need to remember that this issue is still not the majority of content that's online, and that most people are actually really skeptical. And those are the people we can also harness to be trusted messengers. It's like the people who see and don't believe it, which our studies find are like way more than 50% of communities. So.
All right, let me open this up. I saw firsthand.
Hi, thank you all for this very interesting conversation. I have a short comment and then a question about how we can help people, to be immune or to be inoculated against this disinformation. I'm a big advocate for media literacy. So we need also to try to push hard. So in the curriculum, in school curriculums, there's a strong component of critical thinking skills that are related to media, how students, how people relate to media, and ask questions like whatever like good reporter will do, like who is giving me this information, what is the background of this person or this group. Also check with other sources. And because not necessarily everybody that has a title of scientist is behind the truth. And we have seen that there's tactics of people that have like doctorate degrees is speaking against some real solutions, and they are working for big oil companies or very big interests. There's a very good book. It was published like I think almost a decade ago. It's called Merchants of Doubt. It was published by historian of science Naomi Oreskes and Jeff Conway. Very good book, which is related to, they did a historical analysis of how climate change science was fighted by big oil companies and other big interests. But my question is, in the meantime, while we can endow people with the necessary, tools to be powerful enough to be and be able to discard information that is not, in good faith, how we can break the bubbles that people are living right now, because you were saying something that is very, I think is very true. Is not related to the demographic of the person in terms of socioeconomic status, but it's what type of media and information they're consuming. So people are in different bubbles right now. So how we can break the bubble of in which media, in which ecosystem, mediatic ecosystem people are in.
I'm gonna stack two more questions and then we'll go.
So this is a very personal topic for me. My mom is a conspiracy, she loves conspiracy theories. I know all the conspiracy theories you guys talk about. She even get excited about it. So my question is this. Do you know of any legislation in Congress that can address and put guardrails to misinformation? And if there is something in Congress, how this legislation will look like?
Anyone else?
Thanks, and thank you all for all your work. One thing I wanted to pick up on, Roberto, what you were saying about like the trusted messengers. And in Santiago, in the report, we found there were certain people who rose up, like the Jordan Petersons and the Michael Schellenbergers in the English language world who get translated. I wonder what the three of you think of like taking an approach to discredit the worst disinformers among them as people who are, supposedly, posing as scientists, like especially Jordan Peterson, and really betraying that trust because they're do you think that could work to at least defang that one group of them?
Ready, your last one? All right, one last one. Good memories.
I'm Tony Delgado from the Southern Coast, Puerto Rico. Good work as research. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about your methodology. We all know that the Hispanic population is monolithic and extremely heterogeneous. So if you could talk a little bit whether some of the differences or the response based on national origin or age or region would help us better understand and be more specific in responses.
Okay, I'm gonna do all four of them, so So the first question on reaching people and where they consume media. So, I think you have to be, I think you have to be aware of who you're trying to target. So in our case, for example, sometimes we say that it is more strategic to target the uncertain with messaging than it is to target the people who already believe something. So maybe because the majority are uncertain, that's where you start. Now, finding those people, I think, requires being very creative and understanding who you're trying to find. So, for example, a partner organization of ours called United We Dream is running a program to reach young Latino men who play a lot of video games. And so they are actually running a program on Discord, and they're running campaigns of proactive good information about immigration and legislation in those places where those guys are playing video games. And so it's both kind of using video game to pique their interest in the campaign, so like references in video games, and also being in the places where the video games are being played. So I think we have to be creative to kind of break the bubbles. On the legislation question, my one big thing is it is really dangerous and a slippery slope to legislate on content because it requires that you be the arbiter of truth, and that can be really difficult to do. And so to your question, I would actually flag Senator Lujan's piece of legislation, the Listos Act, or different legislation that addresses infrastructure and illicit behavior of networks, not content specific things. So the Listos Act, for example, is advocating for platforms to invest more equitably in content moderation non-English languages. So it would require that they disclose the level of investment and how many people they've hired to do non-English language moderation, create reports that are I think it's annually, but like create recurring reports that put that out there, so increasing transparency. And then it allocates funding for civil society organizations through USAID to study this problem in different countries. So I think legislation that addresses the infrastructure or business models that are faulty or things like that are much better than prohibiting content, certain types of content. So, even more questions.
I will answer the comms question. So.
One last thing on the methodology question, actually, please. So we that poll we did last year, we're doing a second analysis of it to understand the impact on subgroups. So we are actually trying to determine who the people are that see and believe disinformation, and whether they share specific demographics, or whether certain countries of origin, people from certain countries believe this more than the other. Preliminary analysis says that those things like age, country of origin, are actually less factors in whether people believe than things like where they're consuming information and how partisan they are, and whether they are conspiracy thinking. But we'll come out with that research in the next month, and I'll make sure to follow up on that. But to your point, Latinos are not a monolith, and this plays out differently in different states, and different contexts. But I do think the trends are by and large similar. And so if we can address similar trends, I think that it could have an effect in different places.
On the bubble question first, I think from a communications point of view, like media training is one of the most important things that we need to do at all levels, at national level, state level, for Spanish media. And in my experience working with them, it's crucial to identify the messages, and also for reporters to make their life easy. I mean, I have been there. I had to cover immigration, education, jobs, etc. It's a lot. And climate is a new issue for a lot of reporters at the state level, especially. So if organizations can help with media training on disinformation, that's a huge help for everyone. That's the first one. The second one, earned media campaigns. I think earned media campaigns are really, really important for this issue, to burst the bubble for everyone, not just the reporters. And we have been working on that consistently when it comes to disinformation. Now, about the disinformers, los desinformadores, right? It's a double-edged sword, I would say, because on one hand, you don't want to give them a bigger microphone. You don't want them to be more, have more power to spread disinformation. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you need to call them out too and say, hey, this person is spreading disinformation. What we have done so far is that when a person has notoriety, how do you say that in English? When this person is well known, for example, President Trump, we all know that he's a big disinformer. So we call him out when we see it. So if he's spreading disinformation on electric vehicles, we make sure everyone knows that this is what he said, this is a lie, this is the reality. So we do it on a rapid response level. And so, for example, last night, we had the Republican debate, and we had President Trump with UAW talking about specifically electric vehicles. We call it like with 3 different specific products that we distribute in Spanish for Latino media. And with less known people, I would say we need to answer that question together. It's more positive or negative to do that, but super open to ideas from everyone, because it's an unanswered question, I would say.
Yeah, for me, it's usually we use Ben Nemo's breakout scale. He's a researcher that put out the scale that's now been kind of adopted by different researchers that determines at what level something should be reacted against. And it includes things like specifics around engagement levels and breakouts and whether things are playing out in more than one case. I think if the bad actors are coordinated in an inauthentic way, so say someone has invested money in buying 75 accounts that breaks the terms of service on a specific platform, and you uncover that, I think it's worth going after that. If it's one disinformer that maybe has like 1,000 reactions to one post, but that post dies after 2 days, and they only get engagement again like a few months later, leave them, leave them be. Don't amplify them.
I can just add on the methodology for our report, at least. We both covered the comms aspect and the policy very well. So one of the things we found overall is, at least in the measurable conversation about anti-renewable disinformation in Spanish, you're right, it's not a monolith, and it's sort of a spread out. I talked about this, the dominance of sort of the Spain-based communities, but there's also very disparate but tightly knit communities in Mexico or Venezuela, Argentina. It just, and people who maybe are just, were sort of location agnostic, at least in their identification. And I think that one thing to know is that the conversation we measured was just really on one platform for us to start with, but that it's likely that sort of, as you know, we talk about the circular nature of all stuff going from, you know, like from Spain to Chile, to Mexico, to the United States. People are sharing it, and they're sharing it in methods where it's not as easy to observe it. So maybe it's someone in a YouTube comment in WhatsApp or something that's not as easily measured as a very public post. But yeah, I think it's a very good question.
Thank you.
It appears that it's kind of has a Pan-American type of and like from Europe.
Well, it's sort of like, I mean, the way I think what the senator said is that disinformation travels the world faster than the debunker can put on the shoe, something like that. For those of us who speak Spanish, if someone posts something and you see it on Twitter or Instagram, and they might be posting it from Venezuela, like you're reading it here, you might be able to understand it. You might reshare, you might send it to your cousin somewhere else. So like it's not necessarily like it might jump from one place hours to another, so they can jump all around, all the time.
Santiago, Antonieta, Roberta, thank you very much. And if you have more questions, grab them on the side, that'd be great. One of the things we mentioned was the issue of climate disinformation, taking people's interest away from and ready to take advantage of the grants, the billions of federal dollar grants that are coming out right now on the Infrastructure Reduction Act, on the Inflation Reduction Act, on the infrastructure bill, under Justice 40, where 40% of the funds are supposed to go to benefit our communities.
Yeah.
We want to do a quick survey in this room. Joan Cato is going to lead it. It's going to be 5 minutes. So she's going to give you a quick background on what we're doing on Justice 40, and then do a quick survey. So that's going to be about 5 minutes. So we'd appreciate it if you stayed for that. But thank you for this panel.
Thank you.
Thanks. So whenever the slides get up here, you'll have like nice stuff in the background to actually, I don't know, accent what I'm talking about. So who likes free money?
No,
I like free money, right?
there's always some.
All right. Who's a member of an organization? All right. Who's a member of their community that might live in a house? Keep your hands up. All right. So Justice 40 says that 40% of federal grants are supposed to come back and benefit people in our communities, like historically disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. All right. 40% of these federal grants are supposed to come back to us. And they are supposed to come back in the category of all these kind of clean energy investments in our community. They come back in the form of grants for organizations. They come back in the form of tax credits, which is why I asked who are members of organizations and who are members of the community that might have households. Because if you get like solar panels, you might qualify for some of these reimbursements from the federal governments. If you go ahead and you have, you're a member of nonprofit, you might also qualify for grants. Also, your businesses might qualify for some of these grants. Next slide. This is a sample of the amount of money that's out there right now that's active in our community. Billions of dollars, not just millions, billions. And this is money that we can access, right? And if we don't access this, the once in a lifetime type of an opportunity may not be available in the next administration. So it's incumbent upon us to access these funds. Next slide. All right. Colaborativo 40. That's GreenLatinos and the 7 largest Latino organizations in the United States are collaborating to try to get our fair share of these Justice 40 funds. So we're going to do this through spreading the word about information, et cetera, about these grants and whatnot. Next slide. All right, majority of our community is not probably prepared to be a primary. Raise your hand if you know what being a primary grant recipient is. All right, some of us do, some of us don't. I would say about 90% of our community is not prepared to be a primary. There's a lot of other qualifications such as staff capacity, UEI, cage numbers, all these things that the federal government requires. But most of us are able to be a secondary if you're a member of an organization. And so as a secondary, you would maybe provide a letter of support, a letter of commitment, and these kind of opportunities to support the grant making process. Next slide. So what can we do to actually help our community get this money? We can invest in the organizations that can serve as primary right now. There's about 5 to 10% of us, I think, out there in the community. And those 5 to 10% of us can try to bring along the folks that are able to be secondaries. And as a secondary, it would be incumbent upon us to try to learn how to be a primary, to learn how we can support the grant making process. So next slide, we're speeding through this quickly. Next slide. All right, so what we're doing is we're asking for everybody to fill out this survey. And this survey will help us gauge whether or not you're eligible or able or willing to be a primary or a secondary on these Justice 40 type grant opportunities.
Oh,
Please take a moment, fill it out. It should be pretty basic.
okay. It's asking for permission.
All right, well, we will add permission right now,
All right.
but please go ahead, fill out the survey. And we will go ahead and do that. All right, if you guys don't have it, we'll go ahead and send it to you guys afterwards. Because I can send this right now to. I could send it to you right now, Natalie, and if you could go ahead and relink it. If not, it should be in the,
So just send it to the chat.
okay. All right,
I didn't hear that.
maybe entering the URL. Yeah. I think it's gonna be up there now.
Yeah, let me just do this actually.
Yeah. Try to make sure that people can access this. Can people access it?
Heather, do you know how to make this? Yeah.
Should be. Yeah, it's, maybe.
Mark, excuse me, do you guys
Yeah.
have access to those reports that they were referring to?
We'll send them out to all the fine people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Better has access to all those reports.
I don't know why.
I think
It was a very good plan. Yeah. Have you seen the issue with this Smithsonian Latino exhibition?
Oh, yeah. Presented by the Cuban Republicans. And,
Pre-filming, collaborators.
a little representation.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's not showing.
Some of the Chicano struggles in the 1960s from the exhibition. They just kind of focus on like stuff.
I don't know.
Like dances.
We'll go ahead and just send that to you guys later.
All right.
I don't know why it's not.
Yeah.
Letting you. It was
Thank you,
working
everyone, for
last
being
time.
here.
I don't know why it's not working this time.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Was that everything for the presentation?
Well, like, I cut it down a lot shorter, right? Because we had like 5.
All right. Thanks,
Okay,
I don't know why it's not.
I'm not sure either, but we can just send it out later and figure that out.
Continue to talk about curating of this museum. And I think there are.
I don't know.
Don't want the museum to happen. They're starting to. I know the people who are putting the museum together and, you know,